Greetings. Welcome to the Wilburn Auditorium on the campus of Pepperdine University's School of Public Policy in Malibu, California. I'm Ted McAllister, the Edward Gaylord Chair and Professor of Public Policy, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to the first of a 4-hour-long conversations exploring the foundational thinkers in education policy. At Pepperdine, we believe that you can best understand even the most current events and policy proposals through the lens of history and philosophy. And education policy provides us with a set of important thinkers who continue to influence how we teach and how we organize our school systems. I'm delighted today to be joined in these conversations by an expert in the field, Dr. Margarita Mooney Suarez. Dr. Mooney is an associate professor at Princeton Theological Seminary, currently an associate professor in the Department of Practical Theology at Princeton. She teaches courses on philosophy of social science, Christianity and the liberal arts tradition, aesthetics, research methods for congregational leaders, and sociology of religion. Dr. Mooney Suarez founded the Scala Foundation in 2016 and continues to serve on as Scala's executive director. Scala's mission is to infuse meaning and purpose into American education by restoring a classical liberal arts education. At their conferences, reading groups, seminars, webinars, student trips, intellectual retreats, and intensive summer program, Scala equips students, writers, artists, intellectuals, and teachers with the ideas and networks needed to revitalize culture. She also teaches a summer class in our Washington, D.C. program titled Humanizing Education Policy, a study of foundational principles. That course and her latest book, The Love of Learning, 7 Dialogues on the Liberal Arts, will provide the grounding for these 4 sessions as we highlight 4 important thinkers on education: John Dewey, Paulo Freire, Jacques Maritain, and Luigi Giussani. Welcome, Margarita. So good to have you here.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
We're discussing these 4 20th century thinkers in the context of your book, which is primarily about the liberal arts. So I thought it best to discuss the framework of your belief, within the context of your beliefs about education and the liberal arts before we talk about these 4 thinkers. So could we begin with some definitions? For instance, what are the liberal arts and how have they changed over the years?
Well, the term liberal arts it's often used to mean the study of the primary ways of knowing the world, sometimes referred to as the trivium and the quadrivium. So the trivium being grammar, rhetoric, and logic, the quadrivium being mathematics, geometry, astronomy, and music. But more generally, the term liberal arts education is used to refer to not just a method of education, but a way of knowing the world, where there's an assumption that there's an ordering principle to all of reality that provides a unity of knowledge across fields. But the question then becomes, why write a book about the liberal arts tradition today? And I think, as you alluded to, it's not the goal of my book, 7 Dialogues on the Love of Learning, 7 Dialogues in Liberal Arts, isn't so much to summarize what the liberal arts tradition is today, but to talk about why I think it's in danger and why I think it's important to revitalize it. So what I do in the book is I start off framing why the liberal arts tradition matters by actually posing a different question, which is, what does human nature have to do with education? So before we move into questions about the curriculum and education policy, I'm inviting readers of this book to ponder one of the most important questions that we as human beings ever can ponder. who are we as human beings? What is our nature? And then I hope in the book, by comparing important thinkers that have shaped education policy, like John Dewey, Jack Maritain, Paulo Freire, and Luigi Giussani, to help readers see what's at stake in contemporary debates about whether or not a liberal arts education, this idea that there's a unity of knowledge, is the right way to educate, because some of the competitors would focus more strictly on a technical or scientific education, because what we need are really skilled people to be building new things. Others might say education needs to form people to create the right kind of social progress that we need. And so there are really these, I would say, competing understandings of what we should be doing in education that actually stem from a question of who we are as human beings.
You made reference to the medieval categories of that constitute the seven liberal arts. Very interesting combination from our modern perspective, including music and others, most of which are not taught in any systematic way, or required teaching, required classes in K through 12, in college, and all the rest of that. Do you have a sense about how would you assess the state of affairs of the liberal arts in American education? Is it vibrant in some places and dead in other places? How healthy are the liberal arts?
Well, Ted, I began to look into this question about what the liberal arts are, why they matter, what's their state today, after myself having been a student and a professor for quite some time. I mean, I just want to point out that I'm not primarily someone who has studied either education or philosophy. My degrees are in psychology and sociology, and my research has mostly been on trauma and resilience, both in the United States and abroad, as well as amongst immigrant communities. But when I had been a professor for a number of years and began to do more student advising, I began to see that students were really struggling to make their way through a curriculum in college that didn't have any internal logic to it. And what I learned was that in the 1960s, a lot of colleges gave up the idea that there is a core curriculum to be taught and moved in the direction of majors and electives. And while there's something good about that, I found that students were really lacking an orienting framework to piece those different pieces of knowledge together. And I began to read, along with students, some of the debates around what have been the consequences of moving away from the idea of a core curriculum. One of the consequences is precisely what I just said, that one of the things that the core curriculum does is that it helps the specialized knowledge that we get in majors or in certain electives. It helps tie them back to, for example, think of an analogy of the trunk of a tree, right? So the different specializations or majors are like the branches of a tree, but without a tree, there's nothing to pull them all together. Another consequence of not having a core curriculum in most colleges is that students aren't studying the same thinkers or ideas along with their classmates, right? They might be living together and sharing their meals with people, but they're not engaging in the intellectual pursuits together because each person is pursuing their own unique set of classes that they've chosen. So outside of the classroom, there's not often a sort of shared inquiry or working through big questions of life together. And I found that students were looking for something more than they were getting, even at some of the most elite colleges in terms of prestige. And so I began to think, how can these ideals of liberal arts education, which arose, as you mentioned, in more medieval times, what does that look like in the modern world? So that's when I began to read thinkers like John Henry Newman, Jack Maritain, John Dewey, Paulo Freire, Luigi Giussani, and others, all of whom had a lot to say about what it looks like to educate people for life in the modern world.
Margarita, I'm resonating a great deal with how you began with the kind of experiences that you're having with your students, and one thing that you mentioned in your opening comments that I think is particularly relevant to my students is that they've operated in for most of their life a world in which they're told that there is no fixed reality, right, or nature. Forget about, for the moment, human nature, just nature, that there's a standard, there is something created that is fixed. And therefore, they've operated without any belief that there's something called truth to which they should aspire. And my experience very recently has been that when you expose students to the opportunity to both get a structure for thinking about these things and also give them an end, truth, that there's a kind of excitement. Even if they're not really prepared for it yet, there's a kind of excitement for it. So it seems to me that one of the challenges that we're facing in our time is that the educational systems, most of them at least, that we see in our nation, are not preparing students to recognize that they belong to a reality, and therefore not offering them the thing that they should naturally be most hungry for, the belief that there's truth. And so it seems to me that's a beginning place, right? That this contrast is between a system that emphasizes knowledge that leads to power, that leads to transformation of our world, as opposed to an education that seeks to understand the things that are deepest in us. Does that fit your experiences, and do you find students currently hungry for these kinds of things?
Absolutely. When I began to think about these questions, I recall very clearly having this kind of discussion with my students about what is the philosophical basis of our ethical or political positions. And as you've just described, there are two dominant ways people answer that, right? I remember sitting with students and reading pages of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. And one idea from Aristotle, which is still with us today in many traditions of thought, is that ethics, how we ought to live in the world, emanates from metaphysics, from an understanding of who we are. And that it is from an idea of our nature, which has in it a teleology, a purpose to it, that we derive what a good life should be, right? That what we ought to do comes from who we are. And that nature, although we're creatures that are always becoming and growing, we begin from a fixed place, which is what gives us the name of human beings, right? And that in order to understand how we should live, we need to understand who we are. Right. Another way of understanding ethics that you just alluded to is actually a rejection of the idea that there is a transcendent or perhaps metaphysical or universal truth. And all we have is knowledge that is used in powerful ways to do things in the world. So what knowledge becomes in that second framework is an instrument of the most powerful, as opposed to knowledge pointing us to a universal truth that then shapes ethical decisions. Rather, knowledge is power, and ultimately, how knowledge is deployed in ethical ways is a matter of personal preferences expressed by people who have the reins of power. So then, for example, in the thought of Herbert Marcuse, the end of education becomes to give the goods of knowledge to those who don't have power so that they can combat the powerful that are holding them down. So knowledge becomes a tool in a battle between the powerful and the powerless, rather than knowledge becoming a sign that we've reached a truth in accord with our human nature, which allows us to develop a set of principles for living together.
Right. Yeah, one of the questions that our students face and is presented to them actually by the higher education industry is how do I best get the kind of training, what they call education, to get the power to participate in this society, right? What is practical? And there's a certain set of assumptions based upon what you just described about the goal of power, which is also, I would suggest, the goal of transformation. So that desire drives education. What do we want to be? Who do we want? What kind of society do we want to create outside of any natural construction of it or teleological construction? And so in that context, it raises a set of questions about what constitutes a practical education. And in your book, one of your dialogues, it includes one of the famous quotations from Aristotle that I'd like to read and wonder if you think this suits a liberal arts education or is part of it. The quotation from Aristotle comes from the Politics, I think it's from Book 8. There's a certain kind of education that children must be given, not because it is useful or necessary, but because it's noble and suitable for a free person. I wonder if this is consistent with your understanding of the purposes of the liberal arts, and I wonder if you could talk about both this claim about the purpose of education as well as the broader understanding of liberal arts in terms of what would be practical. Why is a liberal arts education more practical than some alternative?
Well, the quote that you read from Aristotle, I think, first of all, I want to say, like most people, I interpret Aristotle through the lens of how he was interpreted and incorporated into the philosophy of Thomas Aquinas, the great Christian philosopher of medieval times. But I think what Aristotle was already hinting at before Thomas Aquinas came along and many others of the Christian tradition is that what's practical for human beings, what's good for human beings, is both what's good for our entire nature, which is a unity of mind, body, and soul. So I think one of the issues in the modern world is that when we hear the word practical, we immediately turn to our embodied nature and our material nature. That ultimately what's good for us is what helps human beings satisfy these basic needs of food, income, survival, reproduction. That's practical. But this is not the sense in which Aristotle would have been using the word practical. He would have been using the word, what's practical for human beings is what helps them use their faculties as they were intended to be used. And those faculties are not only material embodied, but they're also spiritual in nature. They're contemplative. We have a mind that is not simply an instrument to help us satisfy these basic needs, but has a life, has an ethos, has a spirit that wants to be fed, right? So I think what I would see in my students so much was that they had never stopped to ponder the idea that their minds are more than a supercomputer, that their minds are actually have capacities of intuition, imagination, awe, wonder, contemplation, and that in fact, to be a good human being, a practical education has to take this wonderful raw material we're given of the contemplative side of us and shape that and form that. And so what a liberal arts education is supposed to do is educate the entire person, mind, body, and soul. And because a liberal arts education is grounded in this holistic view of the person, it is more practical than an education which exclusively prepares us to use the embodied aspects of our nature to fulfill our bodily needs while neglecting our spiritual needs as somehow, dare I say, epiphenomenal, that is secondary, as opposed to a primary, a basic, a fundamental, an elementary need. So I think what I mean when I say a liberal arts education is practical is that it's more in accord with our nature than with a purely technical kind of education, which, of course, a writer like John Henry Newman, who was writing in the end of the 18th century, when he extolled the importance of liberal arts education in a series of lectures he gave in Ireland, which the series of lectures came to be called The Idea of a University. He was precisely saying that in the modern world, with all of our wonderful scientific, technological advancements, we absolutely should embrace a system of education that prepares us to participate in the wonderful things we can do with technology. But we should not leave behind these fundamental questions of who we are as human beings, what is human nature, and what is our ultimate good. And he was speaking to a country of Ireland that was seeking to come out of the grips of having been a colony of England so long, where people were being denied an education. And so in education for freedom and for participation in the modern world needs to be practical in the sense of being integrated.
I really like your emphasis upon ends and formation, right? To make a claim that an education is practical in a Thomistic and an Aristotelian sense is to suggest that the goal is some kind of formation that completes us somehow, that forms us as we ought to be, and toward, in Aristotle's word, happiness or completion. And this seems to be a pretty sharp contrast to the kinds of things that we'll be talking about later, which are essentially transformational ideas, that power to transformation as opposed to knowledge that seeks to understand, to help develop the habits and virtues. I think at some point we'll be talking about virtues as a part of this. Before we turn to Dewey, I will suggest, and then I will ask to what degree. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but to what degree you agree with this, that we're living in a very corrupt time with regard to education, particularly if the goals of education are as we think they are, the goals of human excellence and happiness. If that's the goal, then our educational system, I would suggest, are corrupt. And I would say this is also true of what we have come to call Christian education, which is rarely in our society truly rooted in the liberal arts. And so I wonder if that's wise. As you know, the defense of the liberal arts begins with the claims about who we are as humans. And this is something that we must always keep in mind as we talk about everything in education, all the way down to curricula. So I would suggest to you the competing views about who we are as humans is the fissure of modern life and of modern education. These competing views, that's the fissure. And Christian anthropology, Christian understandings of who humans are, has lost so much ground that functionally it's countercultural in our time, as opposed to being a deep part of our culture. I wonder if you agree with that. And if so, are we in a crisis to which liberal arts is a remedy?
The way I've approached this question has been to get students and educators who are interested in what we should be doing in education to think about, just slow down for a moment and let's think about what are some competing views of the human person, and then what are their implications for education. I often do this by teaching an article from a philosopher named Max Shaler, where he outlines different views of the human person and how they have changed over time. And what Max Shaler is arguing, first of all, he's arguing that there is no more important question in the modern world than to recover this basic exploration of who we are as human beings, precisely because the values which claim to hold the modern world together, values like freedom, the belief in democracy, all of those grew out of a particular understanding of who we are as human beings, and potentially those things we value the most could be lost if we lose sight of who we are as human beings. The other reason I think I agree so much with Max Shaler that this question about who we are as human beings is so important is you alluded to the end of Christian education, at least explicitly, being formation. And by formation, I don't just mean kind of formation in the doctrines of Christianity, the creeds of Christianity, although I do think that is important, contra Dewey, who we'll talk about soon. I mean the formation of a complete human being who knows himself or herself, who knows who they are and has a sense of a coherent identity. As I said a moment ago, if the fields of knowledge don't have a tree trunk to hang on to, do all of our experiences and our different aspects of our identity have a core to which they all participate? And is there ultimately an element of coherence to who we are as human beings? Or are we nothing but a eternally fluid movement of becomings that has no core central nature? Well, what the philosopher Max Shaler says has happened is that he outlines several different understandings of the human person. Classical Judeo-Christian, what he would call the religious or the mythical view of human persons, is that we're creatures. We're created by God and fallen, in need of redemption. So created for excellence, but in need of salvation and grace in order to achieve the purpose inscribed in our nature. So we have freedom, but that freedom is oriented towards an end that emanates from our nature and is oriented ultimately towards participating in a cosmological reality that's transcendent. Similarly, the Greek philosophers also believed in what made human beings unique was rationality. And when they used the term Homo sapiens to distinguish human beings from others and talked about rationality, I just want to point out that they didn't mean rationality as it's often come to be used as just a giant supercomputer. For the Greeks, rationality was open to the transcendent. We are the kind of beings that operate in the material world and have a symbolic reality that we ponder and we contemplate. So the Greeks absolutely believed in a transcendent reality. Now, in the modern world, what Shaler argues has happened is that we've shifted from Homo sapiens, or from the religious view of man, to what he calls Homo faber. We are primarily creatures of drives to fulfill biological needs, and we make things to satisfy our basic needs and wants. So this idea of Homo faber puts man's productive capacities at the core of who we are. And it implies that our most important ends are the satisfaction of wants and needs, without necessarily denying that human beings have or engage with symbolic things such as narratives or art or beauty. But those symbolic things are not thought of as essential to our nature, but rather just sophisticated tools that we employ to satisfy our real needs, which are biological, or, and then by extension, getting back to what we said a moment ago, right? If one of our biological needs, drives, is for power, then knowledge is not an end in and of itself. It's a tool for power. So rather than in the concept of Homo sapiens or religious man, the things that we come to know in both of those understandings of human beings, knowledge becomes something that we share with other human beings that points us to a larger reality in which we all can participate. In Homo faber, knowledge is not an end in and of itself that points to an eternal reality. It's another tool for power and domination in order to satisfy our basic needs.
I'm assuming, as we turn to John Dewey, that there's a strong sense in which his understanding of human nature, which we can talk about in more detail in a minute, but that he thinks of us as creators or producers. that we make things, and that's who we are. And so I think that we begin with John Dewey with a recognition that he is challenging in some fundamental way both the philosophical anthropology that undergirds the liberal arts and the specific goals of the liberal arts. To the degree that's true, I think you'll help flesh that out. But begin by telling us a bit about John Dewey. Who was he, and to what was he responding in his era and his time? Was he reacting against something, particularly in his educational theory?
John Dewey was a philosopher who lived at the end of the 1800s and into the early 1900s. And he's so relevant for our discussion because he wrote a book called Democracy in Education, which has become really a mainstay of educational schools. And there's a lot one could say about Dewey, but just briefly, I would say that part of his enduring influence has been that he wanted to make philosophy not simply a system of thinking, but he wanted to bring philosophy into the public realm, and he wanted philosophy to have a public importance. Now, keep in mind, he's living at the end of the 18th century, which is after the end of the Civil War. People are moving into cities. We're seeing tremendous advances in scientific and technological discoveries. And so John Dewey, as a philosopher, was trying to take serious the advancements in science and the changes in American society and try to put them together into what does education look like for a free, democratic, modern industrial society. So what I think is important to also consider about Dewey was that he was not primarily writing as a practitioner of education as much as he was writing as a philosopher. So I want to talk about what his ideas about education were, but to really understand them more in depth, it's important to refer to other works that Dewey wrote in philosophy in order to interpret some of the things that he says or perhaps leaves unsaid. For example, it's not clear to me, and having read Dewey, that he spends a lot of time trying to come up with a specific definition of the qualities of a human being, the way that a philosopher like Aristotle would have, or Jacques Maritain. But it's implied in a lot of what he wrote, what his idea of human nature is. So to get to your question, what is his idea of human nature? Well, one of his key concepts in human nature is that we are always becoming. Human beings are always growing. We're always changing. Now, and because of that, Dewey wanted schooling to not be a way of simply passing down a tradition of thinking from the past, but he wanted education to be forward-looking, to be scientific. So instead of, let's say, lining up pupils in their seats, memorizing, works of great rhetoric from the classics, or working out math problems and studying Euclidean geometry, Dewey thought, not that we have to get rid of that, but we have to make all of that past knowledge relevant to today and get pupils to do more than sit in their seats and memorize a curriculum. So Dewey likened the classroom to a scientific experiment. And what mattered in education was to have students doing things, creating. So Dewey saw that we're always changing and we're always capable of creating and innovating new things. Now, I think it's also important to relate Dewey's philosophy of the human person to, again, what is not said. So what is not said in Dewey are things that we find in other philosophers, that there's a piece of our human nature that is flawed or has been corrupted by something we call sin. In fact, Dewey explicitly said that we should move away from notions of the human person that have come to us or have been maintained perhaps in things like the creeds of Christianity. So he doesn't talk about sin or fallenness. He's silent on that part of human nature, other than to say that what's valuable about religion is not the tradition of the creeds about who we are as human beings, but the values that those creeds give rise to, right? So in his book, A Common Faith, Dewey says, quote, "In the discussion, I shall develop another conception of the nature of the religious phase of experience, one that separates it from the supernatural and the things that have grown up about it. I shall try to show that these derivations are encumbrances, and that what is genuinely religious will undergo an emancipation when it is relieved from them. That then, for the first time, the religious aspect of experience will be free to develop freely on its own account." What this quote shows us is that Dewey is, in fact, doing more than educational philosophy. He's doing a kind of metaphysics. He is making a statement about our fundamental nature as human beings in saying that what matters about religion is not the supernatural, that in fact we need to liberate our understanding of religion from the supernatural and bring it down into the world. He's making a statement about who we are as human beings, which he goes on to elaborate more in this really important work, A Common Faith, and saying that what's important about the religious is that it serves as an inspiration for our action in the world. Now, at first glance, one might think, well, what's objectionable about this, right? Well, yeah, that sounds intuitively like a good idea. The values of religion inspire me to do good works in the world. But what's being left out here? And what's being left out is, again, the idea that we are beings who are created with a spiritual nature and that we have an interiority to our being that has contact with the supernatural. And that the supernatural is not kind of in a dualistic sense separated from the world. It's inherent in who we are as human beings, that we have this ability and this desire, this need for the contact with the transcendent. So Dewey, to use a more modern philosopher's term, in some ways Dewey is presenting what the philosopher Charles Taylor has called a buffered self, that the core of who we are is not porous and open to the spiritual realm, but rather enclosed in and of itself. And this is very much, as the philosopher Charles Taylor has said, is very much a modern idea, that the very core of who we are is separated from the supernatural. Another incredibly important idea that I think we need to understand from Dewey to understand who he is then his view of what is truth. Because now Dewey has moved away from the supernatural. Those beliefs in the creeds of Christianity or any other religion, they're not true for Dewey. They're maybe an inspiration for things we do in the world, but they're not truths for Dewey. Well, what is truth for Dewey? Truth for Dewey is science. Also in A Common Faith, he says, "The significant bearing for my purpose of all this is that the new methods of inquiry and reflection have become for the educated man today the final arbiter of all questions of fact, existence, and intellectual assent. Nothing less than a revolution in the seat of intellectual authority has taken place." So Dewey is very explicitly stating here that the authority by which we judge the truth of a statement is science. Not some, as he says later on, not some idea of a prior embodiment to which we owe some sort of obligation, not some being that stands outside of time to whom we owe our existence. No, authority and truth can only be understood for Dewey in the context of science and in a modern context of science that Dewey's using it, which is the scientific experiment.
Can I ask, before I comment on some other things, just the word truth he associates with the word community frequently, right? That truth emerges from the community. Could you, I guess I'm asking, truth is something that emerges from a community of scientific discourse, right? So it is many people engaging in this kind of inquiry. And it seems to me that emphasis upon what I think is a kind of strange definition of community, but this understanding of community tied to truth is that it is always in motion. The truth is always a reflection of some body of some group of people who are engaged in inquiry, and everything seems quite provisional in that. Am I correct in that, or does he have a more firm sense of the idea that science can produce a fixed notion of truth?
Well, I think what I've come to see with Dewey is that when we take this step, right, that society might be animated by religious values, but isn't fundamentally oriented around religious communities that have creeds and rituals, and we replace the authority of truth from a natural Aristotelian sense with a teleology, or a sense of revelation, which Dewey is very skeptical or really doesn't accept revelation as a source of truth. He looks for the arbiter of truth comes through the practical application of knowledge for the building up of our common life, right? So the title of his book, A Common Faith, he's not referring to religion, he's referring to democracy. He's referring to our life in common. So the method for truth is a scientific experiment, and the way we know the experiment is working is whether or not it builds up our life together in a democratic society. So this is the appeal of Dewey, right? This is why he was so influential. This is why his ideas were taken and applied in our public school systems, because people would see in Dewey this ethos to make knowledge practical and make the practical build up our common life. So again, Dewey says in his in My Pedagogic Creed, right? He defines the mission of the school in the following way. I believe that it is the business of everyone interested in education to insist upon the school as the primary and most effective interest of social progress and reform, in order that society may be awakened to realize what the school stands for, and aroused to the necessity of endowing the educator with sufficient equipment properly to perform his task. What this quote is illustrating, along the lines of your question, is that Dewey sees schooling, public schooling, as what we need to generate this life in common. And in a modern, democratic, scientific society, right, things are always going to be changing. So this need for reform, this word he uses, doesn't happen one time. It's the continual mission of the schools for reform and progress, right? This is what I mean by calling Dewey or putting him in line with the progressive movement, right? That we need to institute reforms, create social institutions that are forward-looking, that are based on these values that are going to unite us. The role of the teacher then is not to pass on ideas from a past tradition, but to orient the student towards the future and towards playing their role in the community. And so the role of the teacher is to help the student understand and process the social influences around him or her and understand what their role is in that community. Now, again, on the surface, one might think, well, this sounds great. I can get behind that idea that the school is about promoting democracy and reform and bringing us together. But what I think we're going to see as we continue to look at what the impact of Dewey has been and what some of the critiques of Dewey have been, is precisely that he has separated out the conscience of the person, or that soul, that piece of us, which is where our individuality resides, where our identity resides, and has replaced the end of education being the formation of a human person who's able to participate in a democratic society, with the end of schooling being shaping society, rather than shaping individuals with the virtues and the knowledge and the capacity to seek the truth that they then employ in their role in society. School becomes the place to create society.
I wonder if we could go back and to something you said earlier about his the context out of which he came, because there's a number of things in the air now that I think are important to understand to figure out how Dewey functions in the modern world. If you use, for instance, the word progress, which he does, you assume that there's a teleology to it, and there are teleologies for him that we stipulate, but there's no cosmic teleology, and that's an important. And he doesn't talk about nature as Aristotle or others would use it. He uses naturalistic, and I think these are important distinctions because we have to understand that Dewey comes at a particular time in history that shapes the kind of education he thinks is necessary, which I'll come back to in a second. But also he comes after Darwin. And I think there's an important element to his view of education and to his view of human nature that's tied to Darwin. You mentioned that he is formed in the late 19th century. He lives for a long time. The guy almost never dies. He lives well into the middle of the 20th century. So he sees a lot, but what he mainly sees in his early formative years is society transforming so quickly. Industrialization, is urbanization, all of the ways in which society functioned by habit, custom, tradition is no longer working the same way as people are having to adjust to new technologies in terms of how things are produced, how work is done. You go down the list of the ways in which the individual life, the way the social life has changed. So in the context of all those changes, Dewey essentially claims that there is that knowledge that's from the past is inappropriate to our time. It's one thing to believe in a certain kind of God in 1650 that might have been functional. It might have worked for that society. It doesn't function well. It is not useful in this time. Instead, we have to have a scientific understanding of knowledge that has one key component to it. It teaches us to adjust to always changing circumstances. So he draws from this Darwinian understanding of an organism that is always adjusting to the circumstances, and the key to success, the key to progress, even the key to survival, is the ability to adjust to constantly changing environment. So for Dewey, the problem is, how is the environment changing? How do we adjust ourselves to that environment and take advantage of those changes? And by definition, in his view, knowledge that is memorized, knowledge that comes from a different time, knowledge that comes from a different environment is ill-suited to the world we live in now. So if you operate with a set of beliefs about God that come from an agrarian, traditional society, and you try to place them in a modern industrial society, you are going to fail, because in the same way that you take some fish from the salt water and puts it into a different ecosystem, and it's ill-suited to it. So you have to adjust. Now, that understanding of Dewey, it seems to me, is crucial to his understanding about how we must pursue education to make people learn both individually, but also collectively as society, to adjust to constantly changing circumstances. So there is nothing fixed in his view. Would you agree to that?
I do agree. Again, I think, as you have so eloquently stated, Dewey's writings lead to an understanding of the human nature of human person as essentially always becoming, always changing, always adapting. But it leaves unanswered the question of, is there anything fixed? Is there anything stable? Is there anything timeless, universal? And it's not clear to me in Dewey that there is. If we're always becoming and we're always forward-looking, then those things from the past, either they become useful in the present moment for what we're becoming, or we shed them. Or as one artist demonstrated, I think rather eloquently, we shred them. There was an artist who took his book, Democracy and Education, and as you said, where he essentially argues that what matters is what we're becoming, and that things from the past don't have value in themselves. We have to focus on the present. And if anything, we bring the past into the present in a new way. We make something new from it. So she made something new from his book. She shredded it in a blender and made a poster. Now, that might sound kind of funny, but the point is, if you take him at his word, that the past in and of itself is not worth preserving, it has to be made relevant somehow. This is what the artist was doing. She was transforming it, right? She was transforming what he said into an entirely new creation. This is who we are as human beings. We're producers. We take anything from the past and we transform it into something new. We're not creatures that preserve. We're not creatures that generate a tradition where we settle on answers about what's the nature, what is human nature, who is God. That's what a creed does, right? I mean, a creed, for example, the Christian creed, is a summary of statements that ancient theologians agreed upon about the nature of who God is, right? And it's considered settled knowledge, settled doctrine. Dewey rejects that, especially with regards to religion. So I think the other difficult part with Dewey, and this is another book that he wrote, The Quest for Certainty, right? Dewey doesn't ultimately have a grounding for how we ever reach certainty about anything. We're always becoming, we're always progressing, we're always changing, we're always transforming. But when you throw out both Aristotelian teleology, that our nature gives us an end, and you throw out a spiritual body that is the creator of our human nature, there is no end to our growing and becoming. It is change for change's sake. It is growth for growth's sake. And it provides no compass, no guardrails, no direction to that change. And when you pair that with what I mentioned before, that the school becomes the place for ongoing reform and progress, it leaves entirely unanswered the question of, well, what's good progress? And is it possible that there's progress, even scientific, material progress, that's being used for ends that are not in accord with who we are as human beings? And this is precisely the concern that we're going to take up when we turn to Jacques Maritain and his book, Education at the Crossroads, is precisely that progress for progress' sake, scientific advancement for the sake of scientific advancement, led to forms of community that were oppressive and totalitarian. Because without some kind of grounding for right and wrong, true and false, good and bad. The scientific experiment itself is insufficient. So when Dewey elevates and uses the word revolution to describe science as the new authority, he's giving scientific truth authority over moral questions, which one might want to pause and consider whether or not that is something that's truly in accord with how we understand ourselves as human beings. Is it really true that anything we can create or produce and do in the world is always good? Which is here where I turn to, again, to the Max Shaler piece, which I referenced earlier. Another understanding of the human person that he calls decadent humanity. I like to say it means we're just losers. He says that human beings absolutely are, this other understanding of the human person, we're absolutely on an evolutionary path, but it's a negative one. We're on an evolutionary path to self-destruction and destruction of other human beings. That the tools that we create and the advancements that we have, we're using to destroy our own nature and destroy the world and the environment. So again, I think the Shaler piece brings out there that if there's no guide for this progress, why should we conclude that scientific advancement is good as opposed to destructive?
Yeah, I want to highlight the hostility, and I would use that word actually with Dewey, the hostility toward the past. He does make claims that the past can be made, that things from the past can be made newly relevant, but it's in the context of what he considers the great pathology, which is the desire for certainty, which you made reference to. Now, I want to emphasize this. He operated with an obsessive focus upon flux and change. Everything changes. Nothing is settled. That is reality, which is reality is never fixed. Therefore, it follows in Dewey's thinking that if you claim certainty or if you desire certainty, you're participating in a deep pathology. And therefore, you take it one step further, anything we would refer to as tradition or inherited knowledge is as a kind of danger to the enterprise of figuring out how to live forward, how to live in what James called, but Dewey embraced, this open-ended universe. We live in an open-ended reality. We are helping to construct reality by our engagement with our environment. We're not passive, we're active parts of this. But we're participating in something that we also can't completely control, an environment that's constantly shifting. And so as a result, with Dewey, you have a denial of even the quest to pursue what you stress is absolutely important, figuring out who we are, what our essence is, what our nature is, what our excellence is by being human. He would suggest that is a pathological search. So it's not just that he offers a competing view of human nature, which is that it's open-ended and adaptive to a constantly changing environment, but that the desire to have a nature that's fixed, that has an ideal to it, is in fact one of the problems he seeks his philosophy of education to eradicate. He wants to get rid of traditional ideas, religious ideas that hamper the scientific approach to life. Right? So you have to be open to constantly changing experiments, and all claims to knowledge are therefore functionally hypotheses that may work or not work for a while, and then you adjust. So I see him in a somewhat more, I would say, fundamentally hostile view toward both liberal arts, toward Christian understandings of the human or classical understandings of the human. I wonder if you might sketch out a couple of things that you've touched on. One is exactly what is his, if education is supposed to function as a part of a democratic society, and he has a certain understanding of democracy, how does his educational theory fit his understanding of democracy as the larger goal? Let's begin with that, I guess, and then we'll go to a couple of other questions.
Well, Ted, I just wanted to highlight what you said before, how significant it is that Dewey doesn't ultimately believe in certainty. He might believe in the quest for certainty, but he says very explicitly in my Pedagogic Creed and in other places that nature is not a unity. Nature is a series of diverse objects. So he's rejecting the idea that the basis of reality is a kind of metaphysical unity. He's rejecting tradition because he ultimately rejects the idea that there is an essence to who we are as human beings, or he thinks that kind of question is irrelevant, right? What's relevant is what we do with what we have, right? So how does this then lead into his understanding of what is the end of education? The end of education for him, as I've said, becomes then to create schools that are akin to a classroom, right? So for Dewey, education becomes schooling, which I think is important. We'll get back to that, right? Education isn't about formation of character or moral formation, which can take place in school, but also in other institutions of society. For Dewey, education is schooling because schooling is where you can control the environment and set up a kind of scientific experiment. And so Dewey's vision of schooling then becomes a giant experiment where you habituate the student to learn how to always tinker with forever changing conditions. So what we're doing is helping students adapt and learn how to adapt to ever changing circumstances. So by creating an experimental setting, as you mentioned, you're not preserving a tradition, you're not memorizing knowledge from the past, you might have religious values, but you wouldn't have religious creeds, right? He is actually removing from education a lot of what the liberal arts model of education would have included, which is an understanding of past civilizations, which is inquiry into moral questions, questions of human nature, discussions about our final ends, right? Again, Dewey uses this word when he talks about science. Science is the final end, right? Science is the final arbiter of all questions, which, by the way, means God is not the final arbiter of truth. Science is the final arbiter of truth. So then Dewey's idea is that schooling is going to create the kind of social beings who can live and adapt to an ever-changing society that's always progressing and always in need of more reform. So Henry Edmondson, in his book on Dewey and the decline of schooling, right, one of the consequences of Dewey's view is then that schools feel pressured to constantly be sites of social reform. And it really isn't clear from Dewey what the content of education should be. The idea of the liberal arts, the quadrivium and the trivium, was that we are certain kinds of beings who perceive the world and come to know the world through these different faculties, and schooling is going to help us develop those faculties so that we become the kinds of beings who can participate in society. Dewey's view of schooling is to habituate people. There's a difference here between habits and virtue, right? Virtue is a term that means that we have a moral conscience and where the intention of the actor, the person, is really central. But habit is habituating, is training people to act in a certain way. But as Dewey himself always says, that task of training people to act in a certain way is never finished because we're always in need of more reform in society. So what has ended up happening is that schools have become a site of never-ending reform. And it's unclear to a lot of people what is the knowledge that schooling is supposed to preserve and pass on. So circling back to the beginning of our conversation, right? What are some of the debates about the end of schooling right now? And precisely, the liberal arts was thought of as the way to shape the kind of persons who could participate in society, who could participate in the advancements of society, but to form a person, a holistic person. That's been replaced with the idea of education has to make all knowledge relevant to the present and reforming in some way, transforming, changing. So I think the emphasis on transformation and change and reform begins to get unmoored if there's no possibility of reaching consensus on what should be preserved.
Well, I want to get to his discussion about the role of the teacher for him, but I want to do it by way of, if the goal is to make democracy into a kind of scientific enterprise where citizens who've gone through this educational system are always reforming, always adjusting, always experimenting, always testing. And if that's his vision of science, which is a little eccentric definition of science, by the way, then if I am a disciple of Dewey as a teacher, and I have a Jehovah's Witness in my kid in my class, it would be incumbent upon me to realize at the beginning that his beliefs, that this child's beliefs coming into my class, are a hindrance to becoming a proper citizen of this kind of democracy. And so one of the things I have to do is to bring him to doubt the certainty with which he comes to class from his religious beliefs, and get him to understand knowledge as that which he comes to understand through various experiments and tests and trials, and that he then holds lightly as a hypothesis as he goes forward. Is it not the case that the teacher must, in the Deweyan concept, must be about recognizing traditions, beliefs, particularly religious beliefs, that are a danger to, or a threat to at least, the kind of democracy that they're trying to produce?
Well, in my book, The Love of Learning, 7 Dialogues in the Liberal Arts, I talk a little bit with a psychologist from Stanford named William Damon. And one of the things that he points out has been that in our public school system, there have been debates and really declines in even thinking that moral character formation is part of education, right? So what I think Dewey's philosophy would lead us to say is that the role of the teacher, as we have said, is to form habits in the child to make them successful participants in democracy and able to adapt to an ever-changing environment and participate in reform.
And these habits, by the way, these are the habits of a scientist? Is that what he means by habits?
Habits of acting in the world and producing things. So I would put it perhaps more generally as the habits needed to be good producers, makers of things, right? But I think what's missing from that, which is what you're alluding to, and what I think my conversation with William Damon in the book gets into, is that in the liberal arts understanding of education, the primary end of education is moral and character formation, because it's the moral and character formation that's the guide to the scientific knowledge, and that's the guide to what kinds of reforms we need. So the consequence of Dewey's neglect of religious creeds is that he actually also ends up throwing out moral formation and replaces it with habits of producers. So in a more holistic understanding of education, there's a place for the Jehovah's Witness and his or her commitments, creeds, as being an understanding of who we are as human beings, what is the nature of God, and giving a sense of life's meaning and purpose, right? This is part of Scala's mission, is to restore meaning and purpose. Because in Dewey, it's not clear to me that there is meaning or purpose, but yet we have community. So we have community and we have belonging and we have democracy in Dewey, and all of those things are incredibly important. But meaning and purpose are purely subjective values. Maybe they exist at the emotional level, but they certainly don't exist at the level of truth. There's no true meaning for Dewey that I can see, and there's no true purpose. There's just functioning. It's kind of an instrumental vision, right? All knowledge is a tool to produce things. And that leads to a kind of, although in theory, right, it's supposed to be embracing an open-ended view of the world as always evolving, right? And science is open-ended. It actually ends up closing us in on ourselves because the only things that are true are things that we can make.
Right. We actually close ourselves off from any possibility of a spiritual dimension, right? It's now occluded. We cannot look at that. It's not open for investigation. Well, this is a frightening prospect as insofar as Dewey became influential and is influential. And I want to come back briefly to this, the question of meaning and purpose, because I recall reading in Dewey one section years ago where he resisted the claim that there's no meaning or purpose in his system, but he did so in a way, as you mentioned the word instrumental. He did it in this. He says that we're organisms, but unlike almost all other organisms, we're meaning-creating beings. The emphasis upon one of the things we produce or create is our own meaning. We create it collectively in societies and for common purposes because we're social beings too. There's some level of an understanding that we have nature to us, but that meaning is absolutely essential, Dewey says, to living a happy life, or I don't know what word he would use there, but it's not meaning that's given to us or inherent in it. It is a task. We have to produce meaning and purpose, and that seems to me to be a rather large burden to put on humans. It not only is a burden on us, it also comes with that ontological reduction. Don't look to the question about whether we have a soul or whether we have a meaning that's given to us that we're supposed to live up to, right? So it closes us in that sense.
Right. I would just say that Dewey, as you mentioned, lived long enough to engage with some of his major critics, right? And some of his major critics said things like I just said, that it's not clear that Dewey believes there's meaning and purpose, and Dewey would respond and say, I do believe in meaning and purpose. But I would just say that it should be said he uses those terms, meaning and purpose. He also wrote a book on beauty, right, on aesthetics towards the end of his life. He tried to turn back to these things, but he did it in a way that's typical of much of modern philosophy, and that's spelled out, I think, very well in a book by Augusto Del Noce, The Crisis of Modernity, where Dewey still makes the claim that we can have meaning and purpose, but we cannot turn back to the medieval or classical or Christian sources of metaphysics to ground that we're going to find meaning and purpose in the modern scientific view of the human being. And so, he wants to affirm meaning and purpose. At the same time, he is clearly rejecting the metaphysical tradition of Aristotle and Christianity and the claims of that tradition. So it leaves me really wondering if he can ever provide a satisfactory understanding of meaning and purpose and beauty because of his understanding of the human person. And I think what I have seen in students is that they do long to be exposed to the ways of thinking about being human that existed prior to the modern world. And one of the things that Augusto Del Noce says in his book, The Crisis of Modernity, is that modern philosophy has a way of saying, no, don't turn back. Just look to us. We are the progressives. We are the newcomers. You don't need that tradition. And I think students, in my experience, have been absolutely fascinated to read about the medieval period or classical period and explore these questions from a different point of view. And Augusto Del Noce also makes the point that the challenge for progressive modernist philosophers, again, if you reject the classical understanding of the person as fallen and in need of redemption, it's not clear why our tinkering and our scientific experiment is going to produce something we call good and lead people to conclude that the world does have an intrinsic meaning. So Dewey might say he's got meaning and purpose. I do not find it persuasive. I find that for students and for myself, it's simply much more convincing to think of reality as having a created nature, that we are participating in something bigger than us, and that we're meant to use our minds to know what is our origin and what is our final destiny. And that, as you said, it becomes a tremendous burden on students to think that they can become anything they want and it's completely under their control with no limitations. And by the way, no help when you face your limitations. And that somehow in Dewey's idea, we can create schoolings and democracy that, progressively frees us more and more from any kind of limitations. It's seductive, but ultimately can't deliver what it's trying to promise.
Yeah. I think you're so right to emphasize the incredible burden placed upon people who have to go and create themselves. And as we end this session, I will note that the philosopher Eric Voegelin made arguments about education, broadly speaking, that suggested that all systems of thought, but also educational system, that have an ontological reduction, that focus, some utilitarian or pragmatic view of education that tells us to look at humans from a very narrow perspective. All those systems of education are deforming of the person. They are not they're not formative, they're deforming. And insofar as you and I agree that humans should be better understood from both a Christian and a classical view of having an end and having a soul and having purpose that has to be discovered and understood and formed, this would make Dewey's education by Voegelin's analysis a deforming education. So I want you to set up our next session when we turn to a very different and a sharp critic of Dewey. What is the contrast that you would like to make between Maritain critique of Dewey and Dewey's educational philosophy? Where is where is it that Maritain finds most problematic about Dewey? And we'll take it from there in our next session.
Well, Maritain is concerned that character, if separated from an understanding of the human person as created in the image and likeness of God and in need of grace in order to pursue the good, he's concerned that schooling, which aims to form character, but apart from an idea of a moral conscience and an ultimate end, can actually deform character by creating people habituated to participate in systems, communal systems, scientific systems that are actually oriented to ends that destroy human life. And he's precisely critiquing communist and Nazist versions of education, but coming to the United States of America in 1942, in the midst of World War II, and issuing a hopeful call to return to the sources, the ancient sources of wisdom about who we are as human persons, that in order to preserve the good that has come out of the methodological innovations that Dewey pushed in education, to preserve what's good about Dewey's system, to reground educational philosophy and practice on a classical understanding of the human person.
Excellent. Thank you so much for talking to us about Dewey and liberal arts education. And I can't wait to talk to you about Margarita in the next session. Thank you again.
Thank you.